Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 713, August the 5th, 1985. I'm going to continue on the discussion of Simon Wiesenthal, what he did after he got out of the concentration camps and his relationship to people involved with the Odessa and the network of Nazis throughout the world. But I'm going to put that off just until next week because I want to share some feelings regarding what is a remembrance of the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan just 40 years ago today, and the eyes of the world seem to be focused on that event, events, plural. It is very important to realize that the seeds of World War III were set at that time. Actually, America had decided by 1944, when Allen Dulles was sent to Bern, Switzerland, and was working with the top Nazis, how they would control the entire world to take on the communist menace. Now, the account of Japan is not very often described so eloquently as I read an article, sections of a book, From Acceptable Risks. The article is from Greg Mitchell, M-I-T-C-H-E-L-L, the editor of Nuclear Times, and it's also been reprinted in Progressive Magazine, if you can get a hold of it. And in this article, I read an excerpt of his book. He makes a clear distinction between the bomb at Hiroshima and the bomb at Nagasaki. And the reason, you can guess then, is why we never hear about Nagasaki, but all the eyes of the world are focused on the first atomic bomb that fell and not the second. Now, in the World War II Almanac, put together by Robert Goralski, G-O-R-A-L-S-K-I, he gives about 7 sentences to the bomb at Hiroshima, which indeed was important because it was the first. August the 6th, 1945, a 9,000-pound atomic bomb with destructive power previously unimagined was dropped by the U.S. B-29 Enola Gay on Hiroshima at 8:15 a.m. It seared the center of the city for a fraction of a second with a heat of 300,000 centigrade. It is not clear how many died. The official U.S. estimate is 78,000. The figures from Japan are 240,000. Then he writes in the Almanac, August the 8th, 2 days later, Russia declared war on Japan, effective the next day. And then August the 9th, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Casualties were estimated at 35,000. So we have the first atomic bomb on the 6th in Hiroshima, the second on Nagasaki 3 days later. But the importance of Greg Mitchell's research is that he illustrates the difference between the two bombs and what happened as these two bombs were dropped, how it changed the world. And he describes the August 6th bomb, the first atomic bomb that hit Hiroshima, was made of uranium. And August 9th, the second atomic bomb that fell on Nagasaki was made of plutonium. That bomb was used for experimental purposes, he claims, to justify the $2 billion investment in the Manhattan Project. They had put $2 million into the plutonium and wanted to see if it worked. Now, after Hiroshima was destroyed, there was absolutely no reason to attack 3 days later Nagasaki. There was no reason to use a bomb on either city, and they could have put it in a space where the Japanese got the message, even the Soviet Union. But the reason offered in Nagasaki is that the United States was bent on field testing their plutonium bomb. It was tested in New Mexico, July the 16th, 1945. It was only detonated on the ground. There was no proof that the weapon could be exploded in the air. Now, the uranium bomb used at Hiroshima was considered fail-safe. When they dropped it, they knew how it would work and it would break open. But making the uranium bomb was too time-consuming. It just would take too long to get those off the assembly line if you wanted them, too time-consuming. And it was too expensive. You have to cut costs, which means they intended to use it more than once if it was too expensive to manufacture a large number. And the plutonium bomb would clearly be the weapon of choice. It hits harder, burns harder, and is cheaper and faster to make. So the purpose of Nagasaki was to test that bomb. without the field test, the scientists wouldn't know if it worked or what the effects would be. So after Nagasaki, the plutonium bomb was the bomb of the future. Now, Greg Mitchell points out in his article and book, the Soviet Union was prepared to move into Asia, and they had joined in to declare war the day before Nagasaki. And the decision was made of high-level officials who they admitted that they wanted to prevent the Soviets from getting into Asia, from staking any claim to Japan. This was their concern in the summer of 1945. And they decided if the bombs could shake Japan into surrender, it could also intimidate the Soviet Union, and it would allow Americans to dictate their own terms at the end of the war. This is a statement of Secretary of State James Burns. We could dictate what we wanted at the end of the war, being as we had that bomb. Now, Harry Truman said, and this is a quotation located of Truman's, the atomic bomb gave the world a chance to face the facts. Now, what was the fact? The fact is that we can control you by this method, so therefore let us move in and do what we want to these countries. And he goes on to say the military leaders knew the war would have ended. Hiroshima could be read by the Russians as nothing more than a war-ending weapon. If you just dropped it at Hiroshima, they would know we used it to get this war over with. But the Nagasaki bomb was seen for what it was, and Truman said, let's face the facts, it was the first strike in the battle to control the post-war world. Hiroshima got the world's attention. Nagasaki became a second city. And this article goes on to say few journalists bothered to visit Nagasaki. When plutonium dropped here, that made uranium obsolete. Plutonium got on the map, but the Hiroshima was a place they knew where one would fall, and they just gave it the whiz-bang and then used the other one by way of comparison. Hiroshima indicated how cheap life had become in the atomic age, according to this author, Mr. Mitchell. And then he goes on to say Nagasaki showed it could be judged to have no value whatsoever. Those are pretty hard words, but I think they're very existential about the meaning of life, how important you are, and certainly people that run the world, think of us as we think of ants invading our picnic table while we're out camping or fishing. We are nothing to them, and Nagasaki showed the world that people have no value whatsoever. This is what we're going to make, and this will be our stockpile. He refers to Hiroshima as the last casualty of World War II, and Nagasaki, the first victim of the Cold War. Now, Robert Welch said John Birch was the first victim of the Cold War. That's not true. The 75,000 that died in Nagasaki were the first victim of the Cold War. Interestingly enough, Mr. Mitchell says that a good part of Nagasaki was Catholic, and there was quite a controversy between the Catholic and the Japanese after the war for a long, long time, because the Catholic attitude was that our city was chosen to suffer in martyrdom, a sacrifice, to end the bloodshed of World War II. This well-known Catholic priest in Nagasaki was preaching this for a long, long time. And 3 decades later, Pope John Paul II, interestingly enough, went to Nagasaki in 1981 and told them God was not responsible for the bombing, humanity was, and humanity should do something about getting rid of the nuclear weapons soon. I'll have to look up the date that John Paul was in Nagasaki and see if that was before or after he was shot in 1981. But one became the plutonium city and was selected to be ignored, probably because it was nothing but a scientific test case by the United States and Germans working together, already starting the missiles and weapons and the atomic bombs. Now, in an article in the New York Times, July the 30th, there is a reference or an article about a book being put together by 2 men, Arjun Makajani, Makijani, from India, and John Kelly, and they have been busy getting documents from the United States archives to show that the excuse for dropping that bomb wasn't to save American lives that would go into Japan. the figures were wrong. Every time Harry Truman mentioned them, he added a few 100,000. Millions wouldn't have died. A Japanese surrender would have been achieved, and there didn't have to be an invasion. But there were various rationalizations for the bomb, even though no evidence of such warnings that people would die could support the reasons they gave at the time, which sounded right. They told the American people, we're saving the lives of your sons and husbands and brothers by going in this way, dropping it on their head. They won't have to die. Those figures were all off. But there is a statement in this article, a quotation from them. They said, remarks made by key figures to support the argument for the bomb indicate that the psychological momentum of the Manhattan Project, the decision to use the bomb, was inherent in the decision to build it. The military staffs running the war played little or no part in the decision. Now take that from 1940s to 1985 with the Star Wars. When Ronald Reagan announced as of March 83 that he was beginning the Star War program, and Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, sat next to him with this pronouncement, they had made the decision a long time ago when Reagan was governor and taken to Lawrence Livermore Lab with Edward Teller. They made that decision a long, long time ago in the 60s for the Star Wars. And they've already spent the money, and they're already spending more, and the tests of the space shuttle this week involve the Star Wars. We will have the first strike capability to begin World War III, to wipe out the Soviet Union, because we made up our mind going way back 40 years ago. This is what we were going to do. By the time Douglas MacArthur was taking the surrendering of the Japanese into his hands and rewriting the history of Japan and Asia, Project Paperclip with the German scientists was already begun, and they were arriving in the United States to make weapons that would go up in space that would replace the atomic bomb and would be even more deadly with the laser weapons and scorching the earth and affecting all of the things that would be hard to retaliate from anywhere else, having command of space. And the space station war began, the space colony war began, when they were brought to this country, the paperclip scientists, at the exact time the two different bombs were tested, the uranium and plutonium. The decision was made by the Germans and Americans to conquer the world by conquering space. Now, there are a couple of books I want to quote and read to you sections about pertaining this particular era. One is by Richard Barnett, B-A-R-N-E-T, The Alliance, America, Europe, Japan, Makers of the Post-War World. It was published in 1983. Just a few sections of this book I want to share. He says, MacArthur was supreme commander in more than a name. President Truman appointed him without consulting any senior U.S. official or any of the Allies. He said, you will exercise your authority as you deem proper to carry out your mission. The general took this broad mandate as a carte blanche. He was the only U.S. official abroad who could issue policy statements without first checking with the State Department. He made the State Department, he made the decisions. And Ambassador William Sebald said, never before in the history of the United States had such enormous and absolute power been placed in the hands of a single individual. The Soviet representatives in Tokyo, Stalin had complained to W. Averell Harriman, the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, in 1945 that they were being treated like pieces of extra furniture. The Soviet representatives, they were completely ignored, and the arrangement of Douglas MacArthur to the top Nazi war criminals and the war machine was being put together there, and there were complaints that Tokyo was working closely with America, and the Soviet Union realized what was happening. This description goes on, the general had dictatorial powers, which, unlike Clay over in Germany, he didn't have to share with anyone. No businessman, no newspaper correspondent could enter his domain without specific permission. And this is what we want from our military. Now, this is what they want from us, that they can do what they want. Such is the grenade, and going on from grenade forevermore. You don't have to know. We'll have a pool, and we'll select who is there. Any offended reporters offending were left the country. They never could return again if they didn't like it. During the first week of the occupation, Douglas MacArthur said, "I'm not concerned how to keep Japan down, but I'm interested in getting her back on her feet again." His father had been President William McKinley's general in charge of subjugating the Philippines, but told him not to give orders he couldn't carry on, and he said, "I'm not going to give this to these people. I'm not going to duplicate that. I'm going to build them up, not put them down." MacArthur considered himself an expert on the Asian mind, though he once admitted after 50 years living among the people, "I don't understand them." His approach to the occupation was softer than Clay's in Germany. He wanted a generous peace. He wanted to quickly stabilize Japan and secure Americans' position in the Far East. He was a racist in the terms that he said you can't have war crimes against Japan like in Germany, because Germany broke the tradition of Western culture with their brutality. But the Japanese atrocities go back to Genghis Khan. This was in their nature. So you can't be harsh to them. They were doing what is natural for them to do. And Mr. Barnett goes on, he would use these dictatorial powers and godlike awe in which he was held in Japan. They thought he was actually representing America. They often referred to him as such as the second Jesus Christ. That's Douglas MacArthur in Japan. Now, getting on to the taking over of Japan after the atomic bomb in this book, he refers to the head of G2 Counterintelligence Section, Major General Charles Willoughby, and that's the fellow I wrote about in Rebel Magazine and Rebel Magazine. And we'll go back and share some of those words with you in a minute. Major General Willoughby, according to Barnett, this is his book, not mine. This is what he's writing about Willoughby and Douglas MacArthur now running Japan after the bombs were dropped, after the plutonium and uranium were separated. We knew what we were going to make. Charles Willoughby, a longtime MacArthur aide, whose name was originally von Tscheppe und Weidenbach. Indeed, he was so taken with his right-wing militants that he and the Supreme Commander both referred to him as the lovable fascist. Willoughby successfully protected some of Tojo's key officers. In retirement, he became an advisor to Franco, communicating in his native German with the Japanese generals who had been the closest liaison with the Nazis. Willoughby succeeded in putting them on the American payroll. The former chief of military intelligence, Lieutenant General Siego Arisane, A-R-I-S-N-E, was made historian of the Soviet troop deployments. As early as September 22nd, 1945, the Soviet High Command, and here's another complaint coming from the Soviet High Command, communicated its alarm to the Soviet Far East Commander-in-Chief that Douglas MacArthur repeats the same mistake that was committed in 1918 in relation to Germany when they began rearming after the Versailles Treaty. This bomb was dropped in August of 1945, August the 6th and August the 9th. By September, 1 month later, the Soviet High Command is saying that Douglas MacArthur and the United States and the Germans are repeating the same mistake as 1918 in relation to the Germans. The Soviet concern about American failure to conduct a wholesale purge of Japanese military sprang from recent memories of more than 500 border clashes in Manchuria. In 1939, a Japanese offensive on the border was stopped by the Soviet troops. It cost 25,000 Japanese lives and 9,000 Soviets. So in this confrontation against the Soviet Union, it became obvious the minute the war was over, by August and September, exactly how the United States was going to line up against the Soviet Union. The Japanese government had its own Joseph Goebbels by the name of Yoshida, and Mr. Barnett describes by far the most skillful manipulator of the Americans was Yoshida. He would regularly warn MacArthur of the Soviet menace, the red subversives. Did the general really wish to turn Japan red? If not, he should watch the New Dealers in Washington, the idealists that don't want war or the atomic bombs. Watch the people surrounding General Whitney and give more support to the realists such as Charles Willoughby, Mr. Weidenbach, and listen to him from Germany. Incidentally, Willoughby, not incidentally, but as part of the story, Charles Willoughby went to the same Kriegs Academy in Germany and attended that on how to rule the world, and he was taught with General Albert Wedemeyer the processes by which you have battles to control the world, and I'll get to those if I have time. I hope I will have this evening. But anyway, Yoshida was giving him all this business about the people who were idealists after the war. The war was over, the United Nations was formed, and of course Colonel Robert McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, got into the act, and he began to attack Douglas MacArthur's socialistic economic policies as an excuse to get rid of the people around Douglas MacArthur, such as General Whitney, who were not socialists, but by attacking them it made MacArthur look too soft, and Senator William Nolan, who became known as the lobbyist for Chiang Kai-shek and the China lobby in the 1950s, his money and his support were tied right into Formosa and his close ties to Chiang Kai-shek. He demanded a congressional investigation, and Fortune magazine was attacking Douglas MacArthur for being too soft. And as I say, that was what was the thing that allowed a purge or counter-purge, and to get rid of people around Douglas MacArthur, such as Whitney, so that Willoughby would have control in Japan as they put these Nazis and the German Nazis that worked with the Japanese back into power, keeping things rolling just as before. In this book, The Alliance on America, Europe, and Japan, the author goes on to say, MacArthur's bid for lasting influence in Japan was to make what he called the greatest spiritual revolution the world had ever known, starting in 1954. Not much of a churchgoer himself, like Ronald Reagan, MacArthur was resolved to make the occupation a practical demonstration of Christian ideals. And so he says, when 4 Protestant leaders came to see him in the fall of 1945, this is the fall of 1945, remember the bomb dropped in August of 1945, Douglas MacArthur told them, in quotes, Japan is in a spiritual vacuum. If you do not fill it with Christianity, it will be filled with communism. See, there's only 2 religions. There's Christianity or there's communism. And he said, send me 1,000 missionaries. At that point, 10 million Bibles were promptly imported. Douglas MacArthur told Billy Graham, who came to visit him, that the emperor had declared his willingness to make Christianity the natural religion of Japan. But the offer was rejected. The people didn't like that idea. But religion could be used as a cultural propaganda for transforming a race long stunted by ancient concepts of mythological teaching. Now take that to Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell or Jimmy Swaggart and the television priests today. The religion is a cultural propaganda for transforming, and also the fact that it was Christianity that would save the world, not those other religions. And this comes right after the Holocaust, with the purposeful extermination of all Jews on earth, that stated goal, which has been spread now through the Muslim religion and through the Christians, with the people in power having that mindset that Jews have to be eliminated, and that gives them more control to have one religion. Now, I mentioned Charles Willoughby, as I say, in The Rebel in November 1983, November 22nd, and went at great lengths how Charles Willoughby accompanied the Supreme Commander to Tokyo for the occupation of Japan. This is from how Willoughby was associating with Nazis, fascists from Italy, putting down the crimes of the Japanese, just as the people, the Germans involved with the murders at Battle of Bulge, the Malmedy Offensive, were let out of the jail after a while by Senator Joe McCarthy, linked directly to these people in Asia, and how Willoughby worked with the staff of Douglas MacArthur, very influential there in the Philippines and in Japan, in the settlement in Japan after the war. Now, another book I want to just cite a few pages from, important to events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is called From Hiroshima to the Moon, Chronicles in the Life of the Atomic Age by Daniel Lang. It was written in 1959, and it leaves out Nagasaki, but from Hiroshima to the moon, and from August the 6th, 1945, this particular writer went out to visit where the Manhattan Project was and do some articles, and he describes the war's top secret. The atomic bomb proved to be the war's biggest surprise. It took 2.5 years of daily suspicion, hunch playing on the part of the Counterintelligence Corps of Manhattan District, the Army's cover name for its secret undertaking to keep the bomb from being famous, and hardly anybody knew it. It was a sensation when it went off. Now, it goes on to say 250 miles south of Los Alamos, where these bombs were made, the scientific laboratory in the White Sands Proving Ground, the United States government first rocket center, was right into production, just 250 miles south of where the atomic bomb. It said the military personnel harbored an almost hostile envy of the nuclear laboratory. They felt that owing to the inexplicable decision of powerful men in Washington, greater secrecy was made on the atomic bomb installation than on their own. And they were convinced through the rival New Mexico project that they are being pushed aside. They weren't getting enough money. They thought the government made more fuss over the atomic bomb than the rocket in the field of international diplomacy. These men were vying for honors, you see, for all of this. And then this author goes on to say they made these charges in the United Nations about favoring the atomic bomb over the rocket missile. And the press played favorites. We're a stepchild, said a U.S. Navy commander stationed at White Sands. As if atomic bombs are going to be any good without guided missiles to take them to their target. And not only that, we can tie up with bacteriological warfare, and we can deliver those germs. Now, you might have seen the articles this past week that the power makers are trying to decide whether to use poison gas and drop it, bacteriological warfare, when the weapons fell on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The choice was to poison the food and water, or in Germany, and then later in Japan, or whether to go with the atomic bombs. But obviously, the missiles weren't being rejected, and the people at Los Alamos weren't getting the favoritism over White Sands. What they were getting was the testing of the uranium versus the plutonium bomb, and then later having the plutonium bomb, ruling out one and going for the cheaper and easier to make. Then you go to the missiles, and the bacteriological warfare and germs can come later. Obviously, the essence was to test the two kinds of bombs to see which you preferred, and if they just used bacteriological warfare, they wouldn't have known how their bombs worked. They had to choose those cities to test them out. Now, in this book, From Hiroshima to the Moon, he talks about the rocket firings and the launchings and the regular use of the proving ground and the flashes on the desert, and the emergence of White Sands as an American rocket center happened to be, according to this author, accidental, but he was writing for the New Yorker. There was nothing accidental about it. And then it said back in the fall of 1944, the Germans let loose the V-1s, the V-2s, and the U.S. Army were anxious to catch up with them with their rockets, but their hard work paid off because the Army didn't move in until July 13th, 1945, when the Nazi-guided missiles, the original inspiration of the place, were no longer in business. When the war was over in Germany, and toward the end of August, the big news reached the proving grounds that the American Army in Germany was bringing back 100 V-2s in its possession. They were going to New Mexico, and they were bringing back the Nazi rocket scientists to New Mexico. So Los Alamos didn't win out this time. The fun and action would be moved 250 miles south, and the preparation to use that place was ready as soon as the war was over in Germany, which had been prearranged for many, many months. I say prior to the Battle of the Bulge, how it would happen and when it would happen, and then very strategically they were lifted into the United States, over 650 scientists, Project Paperclip, and were brought to this country. I'll continue in 1 minute of Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and our trips to to the moon. This is Mae Brussell. It's part 2 of a 1-hour broadcast called World Watches. It's program number 713. In case you picked up in the middle, it's a weekly analysis of various events, past, present, and future, how the past affects our future. And I want to continue with the subject of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what followed after the bombs were tested in those two cities. I want to read directly from this book, From Hiroshima to the Moon, by Daniel Lang, just a couple of sentences on the transition in July and August to the emphasis from Los Alamos down to New Mexico and the next stage of World War III that was to begin to escalate. This is what Mr. Lang wrote. At the outset, the hard work entailed in establishing the post at New Mexico seemed pointless. The Army didn't move in until July 13, 1945, when the Nazis' guided missiles, the original inspiration of the place, were no longer in business. They allegedly were building this New Mexico base for the missiles and rockets, and the war was over, and all of a sudden the Army is coming in with a full blast where they weren't so visible before, and as of July 13th, 1 month before Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs dropped, they took over it with a large influence, and the Nazi-guided missiles weren't even used. They were used in Europe, and the war, for all purposes, was over, except these men knew it wasn't. Mr. Lang says the people there thought maybe the Japanese would come up with a similar weapon, and we needed it, but when the Japanese surrendered, the men were puzzled by their labors. You see, we're told that one war is to end all wars, and the other one is to end all wars of the past again, and all of a sudden, the escalation in New Mexico. Toward the end of August, however, big news reached the proving ground, and this is after the 2 big bombs had been dropped. By the end of August, this great news, big news, reached, and everything suddenly made sense on why they were set up and what they were doing. The American Army in Germany, counting its captured assets, already had 100 V-2 rockets in its possession, and they were sending them to New Mexico. And it was clear then that by both V-days, Japan and Germany, that were celebrated, that the Army intended to pursue its project into peacetime, this is a quote I put on that, and on a sustained basis. Shortly thereafter, 300 freight car loads of Nazi rocket parts arrived from Europe and were transported from Las Cruces over the highway to White Sands, New Mexico. Now that the station had rockets and the experts knew how to fire them were needed. Here again, the Nazis helped out. Toward the end of the European war, before the Germans gave up, the Allies and Russians independently were on a specialized liberating foray, the point of which was to round up the Reich scientists, the technicians, the engineers, presumably to help win the next war. This is exactly what he writes. Before the war was over, before the Germans gave up, we and the Russians were rounding them up to win that next war. The American undertaking was known as Operation Paperclip, and it seemed to have done rather well in harvesting of rocketeers, including Count Werner von Braun, the expert, only 31 years old, who headed the Peenemünde rocket station in northeast Germany, where the V-1s and V-2s rained on British soil, bombed the British, and then people that were stationed in England then avoided those bombs falling on their heads. The survivors came back to New Mexico to help with this project, and they moved to Fort Bliss in El Paso. The American scientists and engineers worked together, and they, according to this author, they never discussed politics or religion. So well did the Peenemünde group carry out its assignment that Americans in White Sands felt an uncertainty over who organized which, whether the Germans were running it, the War Department was running the Germans, or whether the Germans were running the War Department. At the end of 6 months, the Americans themselves learned how to shoot the V-2s. The Germans were sent to Fort Bliss, where they continued to occupy. He wrote this in 1959. They then were moved on to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Werner von Braun delighted Army officers with his grasp of American slang. He was permitted to return briefly to the Reich in order to marry his fiancée, an 18-year-old girl. All of them wanted a citizenship in America. Their children were enrolled in schools in El Paso. They had automobiles and money when they arrived, the latest models, and were treated well, and the Army carefully shielded them from journalists while they went about and did their work. The Army Ordnance Journal printed a story. This goes back to earlier than 1959, the occupation of Mars, and this was one of their projects. Remember the book Alternative 3, and people put it down as being impossible to ever reach Mars. But the goal of these people was to control the world, and the scientists working on this were men from Johns Hopkins and the industrial complex such as General Electric, Douglas Aircraft, and Bell Laboratories were working with them, and of course General Electric put Ronald Reagan to the GE Theater, so he was known throughout the entire United States before he decided to run for governor of California. Now, jumping to the space part of this, a while later, these men are now in New Mexico and then soon in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And when this book was written in 1958, the author described a conference in New York at the New York Academy of Sciences called Man in Space, a tool and program for the study of social change. And it tells about the problems of being separated from people on long trips to space and the psychological work of changing their mindset for going on such long trips. And they even posed the problem at this conference earlier than 1958. What would you do if we sent our people to another planet and those people were both scientifically and militarily equal to us, but were also in unity with their own mind and were more peaceful in their own minds? How would you behave sending them into that kind of a field? This was a problem. Political order may come about because our people wouldn't be a match for those people who already are more sophisticated. So the problem was, do you bring them back to space, or would they come back with their ideas? And they discussed problems of Mars. And then in these discussions, there was a subject of developing patience, because good spacemen may have to take 2.5 years, and they decided that studying a sedentary life or in a Buddhist monastery would be good, or Eskimos. And keep in mind, in the 50s, after the 50s, how many people have moved to the United States, like Bagan, the Rajneesh group, and the Transcendental Meditation group, and Mr. Earhart, Ludwig Earhart, and who changed his name and went into the Est, and all these various groups trying to set up places for people and learn meditation, and how important it is for so many people today. They've depended on it, and it was part of a program. These people have come to the United States, but I wonder if they are part of the program that was set up to study sensory deprivation and what happens when you're in space and get people's mindsets to the way of meditation, bringing it to this country, useful for space colonies and space stations and future astronauts. Now, Dr. Harold Popinski wrote in the American Psychologist magazine in 1958. He's a professor at Ohio State University. He came up with the notion that ideal space voyagers should be midgets, a female midget with a PhD in physics. But the midget is interesting because Omni magazine wrote an article a few years ago on the necessity to biologically alter people to make them adaptable to space, and these space scientists were working on midgets. I'll do more later, but this isn't applicable to Hiroshima and Nagasaki now. But I have believed for a long time, and possibly stayed on the air, that that disease, progeria, Progeria, is linked to the space experimentations. Those are people that grow older but stay small as children. They're little tiny midgets, but they have adult heads and take care of themselves. There was a famous Meg Casey who died this year, and a woman from San Jose, Alicia Gowans. I would like to get in touch with her parents and maybe find out what medications she took when she was pregnant. I never have done that in San Jose. I should do that. But when you take the pictures of these faces, they're identical to what people are seeing in UFOs that land. And I believe those UFOs are man-made, and that those people are altered genetically in some way so that they are hairless and they have large eyes that almost bulge, big black eyes. Their ears are pointed, small chins, and they have adult heads in little bodies. And this was exactly what was planned with those same people, the meditation and the reduction of bodies for adaptability into space. Just last week, Larry King had somebody on his program, a magician, who partook in a group with the Maharishi. The Washington Times, the Reverend Moon paper, has a large article, well, fairly large, July 19th, Maharishi meditation said to foster utopia. This is to get you satisfied, I suppose, for long distances or somewhere. At the Washington Convention Center, there was a 2-hour session, 5,500 people attended, but he had 7,000 experts in technology assembled at Fairfield for 3 weeks in the winter to give the world a taste of utopia. And he's working with scientists on scientific research on meditation. The Maharishi is active in Washington. He calls it the creative capital of the world. And he described on Larry King's program, using members of Congress and various people, he's tapping them all into what he calls, or what is known as, the unified field. The effects are similar to radio waves on the brain, but it's interesting in 1985 how much news there is about trips to Mars and on the Maharishi and different kinds of meditation similar to his, and also these people are identifiable who are grown up, who are tiny, and the intent of the space program to recruit those kind of people. When the bombs dropped in Japan, there were 3 people controlling all of that part of the world, China and the Philippines and Japan, in control of the whole series of operations there, the grand plan that go back to Germany and to Washington. Douglas MacArthur, Charles Willoughby, whose name is Weidenbach, the German from Weidenbach, from the Kriegs Academy, and General Albert Wedemeyer. Those 3 are very, very important. So I just want to wind up this broadcast on the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by talking about General Wedemeyer. I can't do a lot in the remaining time, but just a little bit of his influence, again, leading to World War III. Pardon me, the plans for World War III. Just recently, Ronald Reagan honored him as a great American. He can if he wants. He's still alive, and he just had him at the White House recently. I want to just quote a few sections out of the book, Wedemeyer Reports, written by General Wedemeyer. That's a good source to start with, I believe, just as I do with the Simon Wiesenthal book, the book that he wrote, take their direct quotations. He describes going to the German War College in 1936 to 38. He had graduated from West Point. He went there and was served in the Philippines from 1925 to 27 and worked with the General Staff School, the Command and General Staff School of Fort Leavenworth, and then was put in the Intelligence Division of the General Staff to attend the Kriegs Academy. That's the German Staff School where they send their people, and he became the first American officer since World War I, Mr. Albert Wedemeyer, to go to Germany to study with the German officers. He was there when they invaded Austria in 1938. He was with them from 1936 to 1938, and it's very important because Mr. Weidenbach attended the same academy and then went out to the Philippines and was attached to Douglas MacArthur, who affected so much policy after the war. So he is then sent to this academy, and he describes going to that war college. I was assigned to the War Plans Division of the General Staff. Now, being in military intelligence, Henry Kissinger was put in military intelligence, and his mentor from Germany, Fritz Kramer, was in military intelligence after the war, but this precedes those days where a member from West Point, a United States citizen, is sent with the Nazis to be trained with them and then make so many influences after the war with our officials in Asia, particularly, where he then went on to China and worked with Chiang Kai-shek and then to Formosa, and that began the China lobby, the World Anti-Communist League, Reverend Moon, the churches with mind control, and controlling masses of population through manipulated concerted effort, pre-planned, and all working and tying together. He goes to the Kriegs Academy. He said he went and got a deeper and broader understanding of international affairs from the German state of mind and the causes of world tension and conflict he got from the Germans. Thanks to his assignment in Germany, he understood more than just what he got in America was a military science, but there he got the point of view of the Germans, and that's what Fritz Kramer was giving Henry Kissinger and working with him and his protege Alexander Haig after the war. He talks about his 2 years at the German War College. While there, they traveled extensively in Europe. He got to know a lot about Europe, and he talks about the German courses that were conducted with extremely well-educated and prepared professors. The great geopolitician Haushofer, Haushofer, took over the classes several times. Now, they explained the heartland theory, the principles behind it, and how the military history was affected by various obstacles that, in this case, they're trying to overcome. So, in this college, they study the stress of the campaigns of Frederick the Great, of Napoleon, of Caesar, of Alexander, of Philip of Macedon, World War I tactics. And if you think that we're behaving like Napoleon in taking countries, or Alexander the Great, those are the people that the German War College studied to conquer the world. We studied the campaign of Frederick the Great and Napoleon by going into the area where the battle was fought. The military history instructor reviewed the situation, analyzed the tactical decisions. My first instructor, my principal one the first year, was Ferdinand Jodl, Jodl, brother of World War II Colonel General Alfred Jodl, who later was condemned at Nuremberg as a war criminal. Major Jodl conducted the course in tactics and techniques the entire year. He was an outstanding teacher. Prior to going to Germany, I read an account of what he refers to the heartland theory, taking the Eurasian heartland to control the world. That's what they studied at the college. He read the book before he went there, The Theory of Sir Halford Mackinder, Mackinder. The Germans had taken Sir Halford for their own. He proceeded to improve upon them. The heartland theory consisted of Eastern Europe to preclude an attack from the east to Germany. If you're thinking of going to west, first take the east. His idea was to control also Eurasia and Africa. The world island would enable a continental military empire to outflank the oceans. This, in popular parlance, meant we would put America and Australia in the hole. They studied to put America in the hole from both sides. It was planned, and these people then took over the Pacific Ocean and the European, and have been doing that to us, I believe, ever since. Remember the word in the hole. In Bismarck's way of talking about the heartland, it was a matter of Bohemia, as a matter of Europe, master of Europe, take Czechoslovakia, and they studied the map and how to take Czechoslovakia while he was at the War College, 1936 and 1938, and then they demonstrated by taking Czechoslovakia later. My 2 years in Germany led to valued friendships. Many closest friends among the German officers were killed, and a plot to kill Hitler in July 1944. And then he goes on to say that those conspirators, headed by Ludwig Beck, were in continuous contact with the American OSS representative in Switzerland, working under Alan Dulles. That's William Donovan and Alan Dulles. Dulles became head of the CIA. The very Germans that were in the War Academy, when they saw the war was over, Dulles was arranging a plan whereby we would combine with the Nazis and go against Russia then, and Hitler would be dead, and everyone would assume, well, if Hitler's dead, the war is over, we'll forgive, because he was the loony one. So his friends there at the Academy, many of them, were used by Alan Dulles later, moving on then to 1944. He's in the school from 1936 to 1938. And then the very buddies that he was the closest to linked to Mr. Donovan and Mr. Dulles in Bern, Switzerland. He said, my 2 years in Germany left valued friendships, as I said before. One of my German acquaintances was a confirmed Nazi, Herr Gerhard Rossbach, Rossbach, from whom he rented his apartment in the Wilmersdorf section of Berlin. I was informed that Rosbach was intimately connected with the Nazi movement, a front fighter. Rosbach fought in Poland against the communists after World War I. When the war was over, he was one of those like Vaslov's army, still shooting at the Russians. He was a close friend of Captain Röhm, the leader of the Nazi brown shirts. Some of Hitler's closest associates thought they wanted to kill Rosbach because he was an accomplice of Röhm, but Hitler spared his life. In his living room, and Wedemeyer rents from him, there's a picture of Adolf Hitler. I had a picture of Hitler draped with a Nazi flag prominently displayed in my apartment. I promptly replaced Hitler's picture and the Nazi flag with President Roosevelt and American flag. But Mr. Rosbach invited me to parties where top Nazis were there, such as Rudolf Hess and Goebbels and Goering and Martin Bormann and others. And he goes on to describe Mr. Goebbels, who had a diploma from a Jesuit college, and Rudolf Hess and Field Marshal Goering, and his relationship with the top officers from the school, who also several were sent, one from Bulgaria, one from Mussolini's Italy, one from Japan, fascist Japan, one from Turkey, and he was the representative from the United States. He tells about going on a ski trip that was arranged for the War College. They always went with an instructor in the first spring, and while they were there, the Nazi troops went into Austria. That didn't bother him. Our American from West Point was with Nazi Germany, the only American officer since World War I, the first one who was over there while the Germans are invading Austria, and he's getting tactical lessons just as we could use to sweep in our blitzkrieg into Grenada. We now can go to Nicaragua and El Salvador and take all of the countries we want once we show that we have the Nazi and the German helmet caps to do it. Now, he talks about Colonel Truman Smith, a friend of his who was the military attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin while he went to the War College, and Smith kept me informed on the Nazi war machine. He wasn't from West Point. He was a Yale University graduate, classmate of Archibald MacLeish and Dean Acheson, and he was familiar with the Army's foremost intelligence officers. He worked with them. He himself was an expert. He kept abreast of the developments, the new weapons, and he also was close to Charles Lindbergh. He brought Lindbergh to Germany to meet Reich Air Marshal Goering and see the German aircraft, and Mr. Wedemeyer was escorting, his friend Smith was escorting Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, who wanted us to stay out of the war and not get involved in that. Now, as soon as Germany was the war with Germany was over in May 1945, May 8th, from early 1945, just at that time, Mr. Wedemeyer, Albert Wedemeyer, was sent to China to be in charge of General Chiang Kai-shek. He said the German officers who helped Chiang Kai-shek build the nucleus of a modern army in the early 30s perceived the basic weakness of the nationalist military establishment, and they wanted to remedy it. General von Seeckt was invited to China by Chiang Kai-shek in 1933 to pattern the Chinese army on the German model, but they had difficulty working with Chiang Kai-shek, and the plans fell apart when Japan invaded Manchuria. He goes on about how the Russians were about to go into Manchuria, and part of the agreement at the end of the war was the Chinese sovereignty over Manchuria that had been promised in Cairo was given away at Yalta, that Roosevelt and Churchill secretly promised Stalin at that point that he could have Manchuria, that far-reaching concessions in Manchuria that had belonged to Russia before Japan went into there at Port Arthur in the 1905 war against the Soviet Union. Japan invaded the Soviet Union. This time they have fought their second war, and Russia wants that area, that controversial area that they lost in 1905. Japan had been trying to take the Soviet Union, and Stalin was assured at the end of the war that it would not go to Chiang Kai-shek. So Mr. Wedemeyer is very important. He flies, of course, to see Douglas MacArthur many times, and he describes one of those flights over them. He says in his book, America fought a war like a football game. And in the other book, they referred to it as a basketball game. But keep assured, for one thing, it is a game to them, and we, as stated before, are not important to them. And Wedemeyer says when the war was over, people wanted to go home and celebrate, and that would be disastrous. That the things we fought for wouldn't come through, that you want to forget the war and go back. And he said the trouble with American people is they don't realize the conditions in other areas or what happened after the war, that there was victory in these various places. They wanted to come home. Congressmen promised to send the boys home to please the constituents and to return for their next election. And for the most part, they were unmindful of the fact that the communist conspiracy was in an even greater danger than the Nazis and the Japanese. And this is Albert Wedemeyer saying, you have to understand that the enemy is Russia, not what Japan did or wanted. Visualize yourself under a conquered Japan, and visualize yourself. I wouldn't be here if there had been a conquered Germany. And buy the book Dora and read about how Pundamund was run, and then see Mr. von Braun, General von Braun, running the space program here. It is horrendous to think what they did and what showed up, the tortures and the war policies of these people. They weren't just grabbing territory for their own survival. The whole history of that war was terrible. And Wedemeyer said that the congressmen at home didn't understand that the Germans and Japanese were much better, far better, than the communists. Then he described, I'm not defending some of the things that Joseph Stalin did or the way that the government is run in the Soviet Union, but a good part of their behavior has to be on a defensive always, because they were attacked from the day they had a revolution, and I think they had a right to have a revolution. Now, Albert Wedemeyer describes in the spring of 1947 how General Eisenhower had sent him to England to deliver some lectures at the Imperial Defense College in England. It no longer is defense, like our Department of Defense becomes the offense. He lectured there, and then he went on to Germany to see his friends from the old German Academy. The war was over now, and after all the damage they had done from 1936 to 38, he attended that school. He went over there to visit the academy, and he reminisces about the plans for a new war. He said, describe my last mission to China, where he goes back after the war, and soon Chiang Kai-shek is to be out, and he's be in Formosa. I was told the communists thought that my arrival as ambassador to China, and that was very controversial, was the result of a major United States decision to prepare plans for a new war. They had come to the conclusion that my mission was designed to prepare the ground for this purpose with the full cooperation of General MacArthur, and they conjectured I was there to ascertain what form aid to China we should take. Now, this was going way back to 1947, when General Albert Wedemeyer is sent back as ambassador to China with Chiang Kai-shek, and the Soviet Union knows that the purpose is to prepare for World War III. Now, in conclusion of his book, he describes Hitler's mistake of what is called the grand design, how he was grilled to take the Soviet Union, how it failed. The decision to attack the Soviet Union was made in June of 41, and the mistakes of Hitler. And it's interesting how he details what errors Hitler made, because those are exactly the mistakes we're making today. We are letting those people who go to the Kriegs Academy in Germany and our West Point and Annapolis people draw on paper, like a ball game, a basketball, football, the grand design to repeat, with the help of the Germans, how to take the world. And after he describes the errors that Germany made, it's exactly the errors we're making today. They don't learn a thing from their experiences. They think if I had moved a little left instead of the right, if I took England instead of Russia, but it's not going to be that way. The Soviet Union knew before the war was over what we were planning with the Germans, and they were forced to arm and are equal or more supplied with arms than us. So now it is a question of facing each other eyeball to eyeball, or as Harry Truman said, to show us the way the world is, and that's the way it's going to be. The weapons are bigger, the people are just as stupid. The brains aren't any bigger, only the weapons. But that is all I have to say right now about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, World War III, and the intent of these people to continue while one operation is going to get ready for the next. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week, and we'll then continue on Simon Wiesenthal.